Good morning. Well, I hope you've all enjoyed week two of the workshop. I just want to offer a few reflections on week two and also some thoughts about week three. First of all, from last week, one of the interesting things was to look at the relationship between the learner outcomes, the learner profile, and the approaches to teaching and learning. The approaches to teaching and learning, of course, is IB speak, and you may relate to it from hearing about skills that 21st century learners have. The IB considers the approaches to learning to be social skills, abilities to communicate with people, the ability to have some sort of self-management, and also to be able to think critically and be able to communicate effectively. Now, I think most of those skills would be used regularly in CAS. It's just a question really of identifying them and explaining them to the kids and helping them to develop them. The approaches to learning, which are inquiry-based, conceptually focused, differentiated to meet the needs of each individual. Now, CAS is all about that, isn't it? It's all about differentiating to meet the needs of the individual. Teaching based on assessment, well, we are giving formative assessment all the time in CAS. We're also involved in teaching in a local and global context with CAS, because many of the issues that the kids have to deal with are global issues. And the other thing that we have that's really important is in CAS that we encourage is about working collaboratively in teams. So you can see really we apply the ATLs all the time in CAS. It's just a question of actually being able to identify that. In terms of planning a CAS activity, there was some really good use of the CAS stages and some great ideas that people came up for activities for themselves. Mariam and Mohammed came up with some great ideas, which I think ecological ideas about actually creating gardens. In Mariam's case, she suggested planting a roof garden on her school's roof. And in the case of Mohammed, he suggested using old tyres to create a garden. Both great ideas, given that we need to have more plants in our cities these days to try and reduce the level of carbon dioxide in the city. Then we also had a couple of you who were involved in garbage, came up with suggestions about garbage collection. Andres and Leif both had suggestions to do with garbage collection, which is obviously a big need in the cities and places they live in. Thomas and Adrian had the ideas of something very athletic. Thomas was going to go for actually preparing for a half marathon, and Adrian was looking at preparing for a marathon in a more mountainous part of his country in Kazakhstan. And both of those would be, I would think, long-term CAS activities, if not projects. Margarita and Esther also identified social issues that they wanted to assist with in their cities. And they wanted to have a look at, Margarita wanted to have a look at the idea of refood, of collecting food from supermarkets which are just past the use date, and then sending those on to people and families in need. So that was really positive. And then Esther wanted to look at the possibility of working with elderly people in Hungary. So some great suggestions there. All of those, from what I could see, would have great potential as CAS experiences, if not projects. Then there was the quiz. And Again, one of the good things about this was that it actually made you really think about what CAS was. And a couple of comments now that came up from people that I think are really relevant about this is that you have to, first of all, use the very loose guideline that there is for deciding CAS, looking at the definitions particularly, and also seeing what possible learning outcomes there could be from it. And in addition to that, we have the biggest question, I guess, is this going to be a challenge for the student concerned? We also needed to consider the ethical considerations and also some risks, what's going to be involved. So those are some key points that came out from your discussion about the quiz about what is CAS or what is not CAS. And one thing which I thought was a really good question that came out of it from, I think it was Thomas, if I've got that person wrong I apologise, was they suggested that one of the things that we need to look at was how many learning outcomes should we expect from each CAS experience. Well, my suggestion, and this is just good practice, it's not actually written down in stone about the IB, is that you look at getting the students to restrict the number of learning outcomes per experience to 1 or 2. That way you get them to actually focus particularly on those 1 or 2 learning experiences. Anyway, as I said, that's good practice rather than law. Next week, week 3, starts off with us looking at looking at some student reflections. And here, rather than splitting you up into groups, we're going to work just as one big group. And so Brett has already put down his thoughts about that, so you can add your comments about these reflections to that thread. Then we look a little bit more about how we actually go about developing reflectiveness in our schools. And the last 2 learning engagements, one is about CAS projects, and we're asking you to come up with a CAS project. And here you need to consider how you would implement the CAS stages. And lastly, what we're asking you to do is to look at some issues there are about working with outside organisations that provide CAS activities. And I think this is an area that you need to be very careful about. You need to be very, very clear about what the particular organisation is offering you. Okay? So thanks for that. I hope you enjoy week 3, and I'm looking forward to reading your posts.